This is I Hear Things for Friday, August 20th, 2021, wherever you get your podcasts. So during my keynote at Podcast Movement a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how newer podcast listeners are discovering shows on all kinds of platforms that your podcast might not even be on yet. And I punctuated this by asking if, when you end your show with, check us out wherever you get your podcasts, if you're 100% sure about that. This prompted a few funny responses. My friend Matt Kundle, who's a Canadian podcaster and broadcaster, is the host of the great Sound Off podcast, which I've been fortunate enough to guest on. He tweeted this: "Thanks, Webby2001. That's my Twitter handle, by the way. I'm going to spend the rest of Podcast Movement trying to replace wherever you get your podcasts. Our voiceover talent are standing by." Well, I feel your pain, Matt. So what should we say? And what should we do? I think there are three good answers to this question, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I do that, I think it's worth a brief tour of the wherever, that mystical, unpredictable land in which podcasts and perhaps the Demogorgon reside. On last week's podcast, I talked a little bit about YouTube primaries, those podcast listeners who tell us that they use the video sharing service as their preferred podcast client. And I wanted to poke into this a little bit more. So I spent some time looking at our most recent top 50 podcasts list for Q2 of 2021. And I'll post a link in the show notes to this. And I wanted to see if there were differences depending on platform preference. In other words, if your preferred platform was YouTube, does your top 50 shows look different from someone whose preferred platform is Spotify and so on? And I was not disappointed. I took a look at our show ranker by the total and also by YouTube primaries, Spotify primaries, and Apple Podcasts primaries. And in all of these cases, primaries are weekly podcast listeners who say that they use the relevant platform most often to listen to their podcasts. Primaries are not exclusives, by the way. Listeners can and do use multiple platforms to listen to podcasts. And that's why there are plenty of Apple Podcasts primaries who listen to Joe Rogan, despite his exclusivity to Spotify. So there's a lot to digest here, and I'm certainly not going to read them all aloud on a podcast. But I did want to highlight some of the more interesting differences. So I'll start with the number one show, Joe Rogan. Overall rank is number one. Number one with Spotify primaries. Number one with YouTube primaries. And number two with Apple primaries. So no real surprises here. As our podcast consumer tracker data has long shown, the Joe Rogan Experience is the number one podcast in America, and not by a little. The only chink in its armor, as it were, is amongst Apple primaries. And for those folks, The Daily is actually the top show. But Joe Rogan is still number two. Joe seems to be doing okay. And here's a more interesting case. The H3 podcast. Now, the H3 podcast has an overall rank of 22. Amongst Apple primaries, it's number 148. Amongst Spotify primaries, it's number 27. It's gone up quite a bit. And amongst YouTube primaries, it is the third show. Now, the Kleins of the H3 podcast have had a successful show for a long time. And if your view of podcasting begins and ends with the Apple podcast chart, you're likely not getting the full story here. There are a lot of variables to take in here. And yeah, H3 is certainly a video first show, and it's very likely that it has more views than it has downloads. But it is a podcast. It does generate downloads. And if you look only at those downloads, you significantly understate the audience for what is a very popular comedy show. Now, just for clarity, my saying that the H3 podcast is number 148 with Apple primaries is not the same thing as saying it's the 148th most popular podcast in terms of Apple downloads. These are ranks of popularity with humans, not downloads. And for the type of human who says that they most often use YouTube for podcasts, H3 is a very popular show indeed. And it's that last bit that's really the key to understanding all of these differences. They're not technology or platform differences. They're human differences. YouTube primaries are significantly more male. In fact, they're about 65 to 35 male to female, according to our Q2 data. Apple primaries are actually more likely to be female, and Spotify is a little closer to 50-50. YouTube primaries are also younger, and they're much more ethnically diverse. In fact, Apple primaries are 70% white, which is, I think, the least diverse body of primaries that we looked at. But here's the real key. YouTube primaries and Spotify primaries have discovered podcasting much more recently than Apple Podcast primaries. In the Podcast Consumer Tracker, we ask weekly podcast listeners what their time in service to podcasting is, how long they've been listening to podcasts. For Apple primaries, 45% say they've been listening for 3 years or more, 45%. But for YouTube primaries, that figure is just 32%. And for Spotify primaries, it's 27%. So for those who say that their preferred podcast platform is Spotify or YouTube, they're much more likely to be recent converts and not have all the baggage that I have. These data really highlight the difficulties that some podcasters have with adjusting to the current realities of the medium. Getting your content on Spotify or YouTube and soon Facebook, it's a technical exercise, yes, but it's also an exercise in appealing to a different audience. And this is why some of the differences that we see in our rankers can be explained by platform exclusivity, but others cannot. For example, it's easy to process the differences in the Michelle Obama podcast. The overall rank of that show is 26. With Apple primaries, it's 46. YouTube primaries, it's 52. And with Spotify primaries, it's number 11. This makes sense since Spotify primaries have likely been bombarded with promos because it's a Spotify-produced shows. So that's really, I think, a platform-informed differences. But take a look at the Ben Shapiro show. The overall rank for the Ben Shapiro show is number 10. With Apple primaries, it's 18. With Spotify primaries, it's 25. And with YouTube primaries, it's number 4. Those differences are just as likely ascribable to demographic and maybe even psychographic differences between the primary users of those platforms. Also, we can be audio-only purists as much as we like, but if you have a celebrity podcast, you're operating with one hand tied behind your back if you're not giving your listeners the opportunity to see the hosts somehow. The Breakfast Club is a prime example. The Breakfast Club from iHeart's number 37 overall, with Apple primaries 71, with Spotify primaries 77, and with YouTube primaries, it's number 6. You may not think your audience wants to see the hosts. They probably don't want to see me. But being able to see Charlemagne the God, that's clearly no small part of the overall audience for that show. For those who have access to our Podcast Consumer Tracker data, many of you subscribe to the newsletter, I encourage you to dig deeper into that platform-specific data. But even if you don't, the key insight here holds. Podcast hosting services have given us all of the technical tools we need to spray our content on every platform that'll have it. But the next level is to understand the differential audiences on each and to have a strategy for each platform. Whenever we hit publish, we have a publisher's eye view of these platforms. We're like the mail carrier in my building here in Boston, toiling in a tiny room, putting that same direct mail postcard into 500 little boxes. But no two boxes are the same, and in fact, every box is its own unique neighborhood. And so we come back to my original question. What should we say at the end of a show, if not wherever you get your podcasts? Well, I have 3 answers for this in increasing order of effectiveness. Number 1, send them to your website. Every podcast should have its own domain and its own website where listening is enabled through the browser and or through as many platforms as you care to list. The point is, if someone is directed to your website, they will be able to listen to the show somehow. Number 2, wherever you get your podcasts, but really. And this means having a presence of some kind on every platform so that you can, in fact, keep that promise. And yeah, that means YouTube. And number 3, I think here's the real answer. If someone is listening to your podcast, you know where they got your podcast. If they're listening on an RSS-driven podcatcher, then they can follow you on that podcatcher. If they're listening to you on YouTube, then they can mash subscribe below. If they're listening to you on Spotify, you can tell them exactly how to follow you there too. All of this is possible by preparing slightly different versions of your show for each platform. And isn't this one of the real promises of dynamic ad insertion technology in the first place? It's not just for mattresses. By the way, full disclosure, I am a massive hypocrite about that. I just barely get an audio file with a static image uploaded to YouTube each week in the meager time I have to do this podcast. It would probably add another hour or so to my workload each week. And, I rarely have that. I am the worst. But if I were a full-time podcaster instead of a full-time researcher, you can bet I would have a slightly different custom version of the show for every platform it's on. Really, that's the true message here. You want to get really good at podcasting? Quit your job. You'll figure it out right quick. I'm Tom Webster. This has been I Hear Things for Friday, August 20th, 2021. We'll see you next week.